Lizzie Susan Gibson, better known, although not famous by any means, by her pen name of Lettice Galbraith, was born in Hull in the Old East Riding of Yorkshire in 1859. She only wrote 7 short works of supernatural fiction. 6 of these, including the story you're about to hear, The Missing Model, were published in her New Ghost Stories collection in 1893.
The Missing Model by Lettice Galbraith.
A plague on all marrying and giving in marriage, say I.
Gordon Mayne flung aside the sheaf of brushes he had been washing and began to stride impatiently up and down the studio.
Why the deuce does the woman want to get married?
He demanded.
What business as a model to marry at all? She is the property of the artistic public, and no single man should be permitted to monopolize her, least of all a Philistine of a shop walker who refuses to allow his wife to sit, even to her oldest friend. It is all very well for you to lie grinning there, Fawcett, but let me tell you it is no laughing matter.
Here am I with an idea, a masterpiece evolving itself in my mind, a picture that should make my name and lift me among the gods on high Olympus, a sublime conception, which I should of course have treated sublimely.
And now, at the 11th hour, my only model, the one woman who is the living embodiment of my dream, coolly sends me word
that she has married a shop walker,
if you please,
and can undertake no more engagements. It is absurd. It is brutal. To what end has nature endowed her with that faultless form and divine length of limb, with that superb carriage, if the one is to be hidden by the stylish abominations of Westbourne Grove clothiers, and the other ruined by wheeling the eternal perambulator down Bayswater slums?
Any healthy female of 4 foot nothing would have answered the purpose equally well. It is a sacrilege that
divine form should be clasped in the arms of a low-born peasant, quoted Fawcett from the divan, where he lay luxuriously among the cushions, puffing little clouds of smoke rings into the warm air, and laughing softly at his friend's vehemence. So it is, old chap, I sympathize. Have a cigarette.
I don't care a blue cent who clasps the divine form, so long as I can paint it,
retorted the other crossly, ignoring the proffered case.
But it is sacrilege that such a model should be wasted on mere matrimony. I shall never meet her equal. My picture is lost.
Rot, responded Fawcett with conviction. London is stiff with models. There is always as good fish in the sea as ever came out. See here, de Quassac is off to Rome next week. He has a capital girl. Brunette, statuesque the reverse of grotesque. I'll ask him to send her a dress. You might arrange with her while he is away. He won't be back till October. The studio was full of the soft gloom of a late afternoon in January. Outside the dying sunset threw a crimson glow on the gathering mists which were turning the prosaic villas of the St. John's Wood Road into enchanted palaces of mystery. Within, a wood fire burned between the dogs on the great open hearth and flickered over the unfinished sketches alternating with plaster casts on the walls, over the 2 or 3 big easels, and the odds and ends of draperies and Eastern embroideries scattered about. Gordon Mayne had but recently taken possession of the studio. It had been standing empty for some time, and he had secured it at a comparatively low rental. It is an odd thing, remarked Fawcett meditatively, that the very last time I was here, Deverell was tearing his hair over the disappearance of a model. You remember his vanity, don't you? No? Ah, then it was exhibited in 87 when you were in Paris. Well, it was one of the pictures of the year, and the girl who sat for it was lovely, perfectly exquisite. Deverell found her, and she sat to no one but to him and Flint, who is his great chum, you know. One day she did not turn up as usual. It was the first time she had ever failed him, and Deverell fancied something unforeseen had kept her at home, swore a little, and thought no more about it till late in the evening the girl's father came to inquire at what time his daughter had left the studio. Then it turned out that she had not gone home the previous night, and she never did go home. They searched for her high and low, had the canal dragged, put on detectives, and advertised for weeks, but it wasn't the least use. She had vanished off the face of the earth, and not a word has been heard of her from that day to this.
Bolted with someone, I suppose,
said Mayne conclusively. No, that was the odd part of it. Her name had never been mixed up with a man's. She wasn't that sort of young woman at all. When they searched her room they found no letters, nothing that gave the smallest clue to any affair of the kind. Besides, she took no clothes with her. Absolutely nothing. Deverell was in despair. She was sitting for Induni forsaken, the picture he painted for McCandlish, the colonial millionaire, and he had not quite finished it. I can't tell you how much he spent over trying to find her. After that he threw up the classic and went in for scriptural subjects. Queer fellow, Deverell, concluded Fawcett, lighting a fresh cigarette. Would any other man exile himself for 3 years in some stinking Arab village for the sake of painting his virgins and disciples on the spot?
Lucky for me he went,
said Mayne.
Or I should have lost the chance of a rattling good studio. Well, if we really mean to dine with Mrs. Lockhart at 7, I must dress. There is some sherry and a bottle of Angostura bitters in that cupboard, and here is a glass. Help yourself while you are waiting. I shall not be long.
Mrs. Lockhart was noted for her little dinners. Covers were invariably laid for 8, and both guests and menu were selected with infinite care. Under the congenial influences of good wine and good company, Mayne forgot his grievances, and it was not till the 2 men were parting for the night that he again recurred to the subject of the model. Fawcett was going to the club, the artist to St. John's Wood.
Don't forget to ask for that girl's address,
he said, as he stepped into his hansom, and the other nodded assent. In the artistic world Gordon Mayne was generally spoken of as a rising man. He had been rising for several years, without having attained to any considerable height. Not that his work wasn't good, for it was, and the dealers seldom left anything on his hands, but since his first exhibit on the walls of Burlington House he had produced nothing very striking, and the critics, who had prophesied great things of the creator of Pelagia, felt they had been taken in, and let him know it. By portraits and pot-boilers a man may gain lucre, but not fame. And Gordon had begun to realize that it was high time he should be represented in the summer exhibitions by something more important than young ladies in evening gowns and the pretty green and grey landscapes with which city gentlemen of artistic predilections like to adorn their suburban dining rooms. He had waited a long time for an inspiration, and at last the inspiration had come. On the afternoon following Mrs. Lockhart's dinner, Mayne was busily engaged in roughing out his idea with a bit of charcoal. A single female figure, 3/4 length and life-size. Against a curtained doorway, the left hand drew aside the heavy draperies, the right raised the veil from the face. The picture was to be called Avenged, and the expression of the woman was to convey its own story to the spectator. If only he could find an adequate model, Mayne felt the composition must prove a success. He was sensible of an enthusiasm for the subject which had latterly been wanting in his work, and he was deeply engrossed in the sketch when someone knocked at the outer door. It was a low, almost timid knock, which had to be twice repeated before the artist's attention was fairly arrested. Rather reluctantly he rose to answer the summons. It was almost dark outside, and his eyes, dazzled by the bright light of the studio, took in with difficulty the lineaments of the woman standing on the threshold. She did not speak, only stood looking wistfully into the lighted room.
"You want to see me?"
Maine inquired courteously.
"Will you come in?"
He threw back the door. As she stepped forward, he saw that his visitor was a young woman, considerably above the average height, and that she moved superbly, with the natural grace of a perfectly formed and healthy girl. A second glance assured him that she was undeniably pretty. She was well, but not fashionably dressed in some black clinging material which hung in straight, almost classical folds. As she reached the center of the room, she turned and threw back the veil she wore with a gesture that brought an involuntary exclamation to the painter's lips. It was the precise action he had attributed to the figure in his sketch. His eyes devoured the faultless features, the exquisite coloring of the face before him, the rich tint of the chestnut hair visible beneath her hat, the expression of the wonderful eyes. For a few moments he stood silently gazing, lost in admiration of her singular beauty. Then, finding she made no effort to explain her errand, he became conscious of the absurdity of the situation.
"You wish to see me,"
he said.
"What can I do for you?"
Her eyes rested on the unfinished sketch as she answered in a low voice.
"You require a model."
It flashed across Maine that this must be the girl Fawcett had mentioned, and he inwardly endorsed his friend's encomiums on de Quassac's protégé. He began at once to explain his requirements, hours, etc. She listened quietly, answering his direct questions, but never volunteering a remark. When the arrangements were completed, she declined his offer of refreshment and went to the door. As he showed her out, the young man reminded her that he knew neither her name nor address. The girl raised her beautiful eyes slowly to his face.
"I shall be here at 10.
She answered, and slipped past him into the darkness. Later in the evening a telegram was delivered at the studio. It was from Fawcett, stating that he was on the point of starting for Athens, in consequence of a dispatch apprising him of the sudden death at the British Embassy of his eldest brother. Maine threw himself heart and soul into his new work. The model proved an admirable sitter. She caught the spirit not only of the pose but of the facial expression, and her powers of endurance were remarkable. She could stand for almost any length of time without evincing the slightest fatigue. As the work grew under his hand, Maine became more and more fascinated. His artistic sensibilities were roused to a species of exaltation. The picture was never absent from his thoughts by day, and all night long he dreamed of it. The singular beauty of his model exercised over him an almost magnetic influence. The hours he spent with her in the studio were like an introduction into a new and unknown world. Without analyzing the cause, he was conscious in her presence of a keen delight to which he had hitherto been a stranger. He was jealous of any eye but his resting on that exquisite face, and denied himself to all visitors during the sittings. He worked for the most part in silence. The girl never spoke unless directly addressed. She was surrounded by an atmosphere of mystery. She showed the strongest aversion to meeting with strangers, and on 2 occasions on which in the early days of her engagement Maine had received friends, she disappeared and did not return until he was again alone. It was not until after she had been sitting to him for several weeks that the artist learned her name and address, and then only on condition that he should make no use of his knowledge except under urgent necessity. He gave the promise readily, as he would have agreed to anything she required, for she had obtained a remarkable influence over the young man. Without a word having passed between them, he was deeply in love with his model, and he believed that she understood his unexpressed sentiment towards her. At the end of April, Fawcett returned to town. Family affairs had detained him abroad far into February, after which he had accompanied a relative on a protracted yachting trip. One of his first visits was paid to the studio in St. John's Wood. He found Mayne at home and disengaged. The two men had not corresponded, and Fawcett inquired with interest after the progress of his friend's work. "How did you manage about your model?" he asked, when he had settled himself on the divan and lighted the usual cigarette. "I thought once of writing to de Croissac about that girl, but I didn't know his address in Rome, and the news of poor Bob's death drove everything else out of my head before I left England." Mayne stared at him blankly.
"But you did send her,"
he said.
"She came the very next day."
"She? Who?"
"The model, of course. And I can never thank you sufficiently for what you did for me. She is an inspiration. I can honestly say that picture is the best thing I have ever done. It is splendidly hung online at the end of the second room. See here."
He pointed to the black and white study which hung on the opposite wall.
"That gives you a faint idea of it."
Fawcett pulled himself up and went over to the sketch. As his eyes rested on it, his face changed. "Good God!" he exclaimed. "Who sat for that?"
"De Croissac's model, the girl you sent, and the most perfect woman in the whole world."
"Are you off your head?" cried Fawcett. "That is no more de Croissac's model than I am, and I never sent anyone. That is... Great heavens! Mayne, don't play the fool. Where did you find her? How did she get here? Answer me." As the artist stood in silent amazement at this unprecedented outburst of excitement on the part of his impassive friend, "Where, in the name of all that is wonderful, did you come across Violet Lucas?"
"You know her name?"
"Know her name," repeated the other impatiently. "Wasn't her name advertised in every paper at every police station in London? I tell you the original of that picture is none other than Deveril's lost model. The girl who disappeared 3 years ago." The private view of the Royal Academy was, if anything, more largely attended than usual. All sorts and conditions of notabilities thronged the principal rooms. Lady journalists taking hasty notes of the costume worn by a charming young duchess who was making a tour of inspection under the President's guidance. A leading scientist was arm in arm with a well-known writer of burlesque. RAs and ARAs by the dozen. Stars of the artistic and dramatic firmament, authors, critics, a mammoth picture dealer, a host of people merely smart, and a smaller sprinkling of those who could not boast even that most modern of all claims to notoriety.
"Very fine picture. Long way the strongest thing we have seen of yours since Pelagia."
The great dealer nodded approvingly at Mayne, who stood chatting with Fawcett at a short distance from his work.
"I said just now to McCandless, he's the man for you. If you want to see the picture of the year, I said, there it is. Mayne is a coming man. If you don't take it, I shall. Don't you let him have it a penny under 600. I'll give 500 myself for it any day. It's a very fine work."
"Yes," put in the critic of a leading journal, who was also an old friend of the artist.
"It takes a lot of punishment to make you try, old man, but when you are screwed up to the point, you are capable of cutting down your field. I've had my knife into you consistently for about 4 years now, and at last I have succeeded in driving you to produce a picture worth criticizing.
Here is McCandlish,
said Bignold.
You don't know him, I think.
He turned to the newcomer with a few words of explanation and presented Maine. The millionaire was a big man, verging on 50, with immense shoulders and a fresh-coloured, rather sensual face. He acknowledged the introduction in a somewhat off-hand manner and glanced at the picture. The eyes of 3 of the little group turned in the same direction, but Fawcett, who happened to be looking at the Australian, saw him give an irrepressible start.
"When was this picture painted, Mr. Maine?"
he asked, in a tone that was a trifle too casual.
I finished it 3 weeks ago.
"Did you work from a model?"
Certainly. And it is a very faithful portrait.
McCandlish could not take his eyes off the canvas. It had evidently made a great impression on him. With an attempt at carelessness which was not lost on one at least of his auditors, he continued.
"The picture bears a striking resemblance to one already in my possession, but the lady who sat for that is dead, I am told."
Perhaps, to his dying day, Fawcett will never know what prompted the remark. Miss Lucas is not dead. Perhaps before long she may be.
Avenged.
Said a clear voice at his elbow.
Number 112.
The lady who had spoken passed on, but Fawcett, turning, saw that every vestige of colour had died out of the Australian's face. His jaw dropped. His eyes were staring straight before him, where, close by the barrier, stood a tall, graceful woman, dressed in black. With her right hand she raised the veil she wore, and disclosed the exquisite features of Maine's mysterious model, the original of the picture behind her, the missing Violet Lucas. For a brace of seconds Fawcett held his breath. Then he caught sight of Maine's face, beaming with delight, and knew that he was not dreaming. With a stifled cry of,
"My God!"
McCandlish staggered back and clung to Bignold's arm for support. The exclamation distracted Fawcett's attention. When he looked again for the girl, she was gone. Maine had also vanished among the crowd, and Bignold, with consternation written on his broad red face, was inquiring of the colonial what the deuce was the matter with him. McCandlish looked ghastly.
"It is nothing,"
he stammered.
"A sort of attack I have sometimes. Over directly. Help me to get out of this. The heat is stifling."
The good-natured dealer shouldered a passage through the crowd. Fawcett turned to the critic.
Did you see that girl?
He asked.
The one in green, hardly a girl, 40 if she is a day, but a handsome woman still.
No, impatiently. The girl in black who was standing in front of Maine's picture. The other stared.
Is it a riddle?
He inquired.
I'm not good at riddles. Ask me another.
You must have seen her, Fawcett urged. It was Maine's model. What is the joke? He added, shortly, as his companion broke into a broad smile.
My dear chap, if it were anyone but you, I should ask where you had been lunching.
I don't know what the devil you mean, was the retort. The girl was there. McCandlish saw her, so did Maine. So must you. Unless you are blind. She was standing there, indicating the spot. The other man instantly became grave.
You have been overdoing it a little,
he said.
I know the sort of thing. Get it myself sometimes. Go and see your doctor and take it easy for a bit.
Do you think I am mad or drunk? Said Fawcett indignantly.
Neither, but a little overworked. On my honour, old man. There was no one there.
Without another word, Fawcett left him. Elbowing his way to the door, he met Bignold. Where is McCandlish? He asked.
I've put him into a cab and sent him home. He seemed all right when I got him outside. Queer sort of attack, wasn't it?
Very, Fawcett assented dryly. The sight of that girl startled him, I suppose.
What girl?
The situation was becoming critical. The young man pulled himself together. Did you not see? He inquired, trying hard to keep his temper. A woman in black standing before Maine's picture.
What the deuce are you driving at? I was straight opposite the picture, and there wasn't any woman that I saw.
There was no mistaking the sincerity of his tone. Fawcett muttered something about a mistake, and went in search of Maine. He found the artist returning breathless from the hall.
I cannot find her anywhere,
he began.
I have been through all the rooms and out into the street. I asked the constable downstairs, but no one seems to have seen her. It is very odd.
Very odd, indeed, was Fawcett's answer. Come outside, where we can talk quietly. There is more in this than meets the eye. Look here, was his next remark when he had related what had passed during Maine's absence. There is a screw loose somewhere. I do not believe in spiritualism and that sort of thing, but I mean to get to the bottom of this business. You say Miss Lucas gave you her address. You must communicate with her.
But,
objected Maine,
she said I could not see her for 3 weeks, and I promised not to use the address except under urgent necessity.
The necessity is urgent. I met Flint last night, and he told me. I was making inquiries about her. That Miss Lucas's people know nothing of her whereabouts. They believe her to be dead. Now, she was a good girl, and devoted to her father and sister. If she were living in town, a free agent, would she keep them in ignorance of her fate?
Then you think...
Never mind what I think. What is her address?
Alma Cottage, Southsea Road, Hampstead. Shall I write?
No, said Fawcett. We will go. You shall see her while I wait in the cab. If she is not home, you can write tonight. They hailed a hansom and gave the address. Fawcett sat back in the cab, smoking and thinking. Maine leaned forward with his arms on the doors, his face flushed with excitement and expectation.
Suppose she is not in,
he said once.
Of course she won't be in. She will not have had time to get home.
Then we will wait till she is in, was the quiet reply. After an interminable drive, they reached Sancerre Road. It was a dreary, out-of-the-way sort of place, bordered on either side by small detached villas, each surrounded by a wall, the top of which was encrusted with broken glass. All were dismal. Several were unoccupied. Before one of the latter the hansom stopped, and the driver lifted the trap.
"This is Alma Cottage, sir,"
he said.
"But there don't seem to be anyone living there."
Maine sprang out. The name was clearly painted on each of the dingy stuccoed gateposts. The gate was padlocked, the garden neglected, the shutters were closed, and the blinds drawn down. There was a bell at the gate, and the artist pulled it vigorously. It was very stiff, and beyond the creaking of the wire elicited no response. Perhaps there is another house of the same name, Fawcett suggested to the man. Drive up the road and back slowly. The cabby obeyed. He walked his horse along by the curb, scanning the names on every gate. There was no other Alma Cottage. Maine was still struggling with the bell. An old man carrying an armful of gardener's tools had stopped to look at him.
"There ain't no manner of use you're ringing there, sir,"
he said presently.
"The place has been empty this 3 year.
Who does it belong to? Asked Fawcett, who had come up in time to hear the last sentence.
I've heard tell as the last party who had it was called Johnson, but I never seed anyone but the servant there. The gentleman only came down irregular like, of a night."
And he grinned significantly. is the place to let.
There's never been no board up, but Mr. Standing, the agent, used to have the letting of it.
Where is he to be found? The man told him. Fawcett gave him a shilling and got into the cab. We will see the agent, he said. The agent proved to be an affable gentleman who wore a checked suit, a crimson tie, and several rings. Yes, he had the management of the Seance Road property, knew Alma Cottage perfectly, but it was not to let. The present owner was abroad. Yes, he had been abroad for some time, but he had no intention of letting the house, had refused several offers for it already. I have rather a fancy for the place, Fawcett suggested mendaciously. I should be quite willing to meet your client on his own terms.
Not the least use, sir. Mr. Johnson won't let at any price. He may return to England some day soon, and he would require the house again.
It must get very damp,
said Mayne thoughtfully.
But I suppose there is a caretaker who looks after it.
The agent did not know. There was nothing for it but to return to town. When Fawcett had left his friend at the club, he took a fresh cab, drove to a large house in Park Lane, and inquired for Mr. McCandlish. The servant informed him that his master had left for the Continent 2 hours before, and did not know when he would be back. The journey was quite unexpected. Mr. McCandlish had left no address. He would wire in the morning where his letters were to be sent. Fawcett gave the man his card. I wish particularly to see Mr. McCandlish, he said, but I suppose I must wait now. Let me have his address as soon as you know it. He slipped half a sovereign into the servant's hand and went back to the club. On the way he stopped at a telegraph office and dispatched a message. Alma Cottage, Seance Road, Hampstead. Find out all possible about owner and caretaker, if practicable to get into house. Urgent. Fawcett. The telegram was sent to Hayward, 112 Denby Street, Pimlico. One thing is certain, he said later on to Mayne, and that is that McCandlish knows something about the girl. He saw the likeness, and he recognized the original. He was awfully upset, and he bolts forthwith. If she is alive, he is afraid of meeting her, and 3 of us saw her. Fawcett struck a match very deliberately, or thought we did.
I did see her,
said Mayne doggedly. But Bignold and Vernon did not. Why did she give you that address?
I don't know.
Very unwillingly. I do. It was because that house was the last address she had to give, and I believe that it is there we shall find her.
You think it possible that she can be concealed about the premises?
Yes, said Fawcett coolly. Four days later, Mayne received an urgent summons to his friend's chambers. He found him closeted with a short, commonplace man, whom he introduced as Mr. Hayward. The artist recognized the name as that of a detective whom Fawcett had come across professionally, and of whose judgment and tact he held a very high opinion. Another link in the chain, he remarked, without wasting time in preliminaries. Now, Hayward, tell your own story.
Not much of a story yet, sir, but Mr. Johnson, the owner of Alma Cottage, is really McCandlish, the millionaire. He took the house on lease from February 86 and put in a housekeeper. He was never there in the daytime. Used to go down late at night with a friend. Not always the same, and leave in a few hours or early next morning. In April 87 he bought the place and has never occupied it since. A caretaker goes in and opens the windows now and again. Crusty old party, of the name of Short. Not to be bought. Says her orders are to admit no one. And she ain't gonna lose a good job along of strangers.
What is there at the back?
Garden of house in Randolph Street, unoccupied. Windows of adjoining houses don't overlook the premises, leastways only the garden.
Mayne rose suddenly.
I am going over that house tonight,
he said, in a hard, strained voice. Yes, agreed Fawcett quietly. Will you bring some tools, Hayward?
It is a criminal offence, Mr. Fawcett.
I have already told you that I take the entire responsibility. You shall lose nothing by the business. What time?
About 11.
Answered the detective, shrugging his shoulders.
Better meet me at the end of the Hampstead Road. Can't go up in hansoms, you know, sir.
At half an hour to midnight, the three men reached the gate of the empty house. They had taken the precaution of separating en route, Fawcett and Mayne keeping together, the detective following on the opposite side of the street. The road was absolutely deserted. The inhabitants were apparently early people, and all the houses were dark. By the light of the last lamp, Hayward consulted his watch.
1:30,
he said.
Constable won't pass till 11:50. We have 20 minutes to do it.
He took off his coat, folded it, and threw it over the broken glass on the wall.
I'll give you a leg up, Mr. Fawcett. Drop carefully. There are bushes on the other side.
Fawcett clambered over and the others followed. Guided by the detective, they made their way round to the back. Once down the area, Hayward showed a light. Slipping a knife up the shutter of the kitchen window, he worked open the bolt, broke a pane of glass, turned the fastener, and raised the sash. They made a careful inspection of the house. Dust lay thick on the covered furniture and carpetless floors. From room to room their footsteps echoed noisily in the dead stillness of the night. They began at the garrets and worked their way back to the basement without finding the smallest trace of any human being, living or dead. When they reached the door of the kitchen, Mayne's face was very pale. There were black circles round his eyes. His expression was one of utter despondency.
We'd better go, gentlemen,
said Hayward.
There is nothing more to be seen, I think.
He held up the lantern and looked round.
Wait a bit,
he added.
There is a cellar.
A stout oak door opened from the darkest corner of the passage. It was secured by a couple of heavy bolts, and across the lock was drawn a tape fastened by 2 seals. Wine cellar, suggested Fawcett. He slid the bolts, which were rusty and moved with difficulty. Hayward took a small bag from his pocket and proceeded scientifically to pick the lock. In 5 minutes they were standing inside. It was a wine cellar, fitted with bins, most of which were empty. There were a few bottles of champagne and half a dozen or so of spirits. Not enough stuff to justify all that precaution, remarked Fawcett. The detective stooped, holding the lantern close to the ground.
Bricks loose here,
he said.
This floor has been taken up and never properly relaid.
He knelt down, sifting the dust and little bits of loose mortar in his fingers. Presently he drew out what looked like a dust web and held it carefully to the light, gently disengaging the clinging particles and smoothing it between his thumb and forefinger. It was a long, silky hair.
"Look here, sir,"
he said.
"Here's a clue at last. There's a light poker in the kitchen that will serve our turn. Just you wait a minute till I fetch it."
Fawcett laid his hand on Maine's arm and felt in the darkness that he was shaking from head to foot. Hayward was back in a second. He slipped the thin end of the poker between the bricks, using it as a lever. Very little effort dislodged them. When he had removed a dozen, he thrust his arm into the hole, scraping up handfuls of rubbish and loose earth. Each handful he examined by the light of the lantern. The upper layer was chiefly brick dust and earth. Lower down, the dust was largely mixed with a white substance.
"Quicklime,"
ejaculated the detective.
"I should not wonder, Mr. Fawcett, if you weren't right after all."
He lengthened the aperture, working with a will, till the bricks were removed for a space of nearly 6 feet. Then he and Fawcett scraped up the earth. 2 feet below the surface they came upon a complete bed of lime.
"Gently,"
said Hayward.
"We've come to what we are looking for."
Taking out his handkerchief, he carefully swept away the white dust. The two men bent forward, with a sickening instinct of what lay beneath that thin covering. Suddenly the detective looked up.
"Mr. Fawcett,"
he remarked quietly,
"just see to your friend. He'll be off in a second."
The warning was not a minute too soon. Before the words were fairly past his lips, Maine had reeled and pitched heavily into Fawcett's arms in a dead faint. As he caught the unconscious man, the barrister looked down into the cavity and saw lying at his very feet the perfect skeleton of a woman. It was all that remained of the most beautiful model in London. The girl whose fate had for 3 years been wrapped in mystery. The original of Deverell's Ennuni. Violet Lucas.
I hope you enjoyed that little piece of fin de siècle supernatural fiction. Lettice Galbraith once again deals with the theme of the wronged woman, objectified, mistreated, abandoned, and ultimately murdered, returning as a vengeful spirit to shame and condemn a vile and violent man. This story appeared with In the Seance Room in her New Ghost Stories collection in 1893. The book was successful, a bestseller that ran to 3 editions. Yet her contribution to Victorian supernatural fiction had been largely forgotten until recently. That resurgence of interest in her writing and its contemporary popularity demonstrates its value. As you can see, I rather like her stories. The dialogue can often be challenging to convey. Still, she was writing nearly 130 years ago, and that is a feature of many of these types of tales. Interestingly, her first weird story was published in February 1893. Coincidentally, around the same time, M.R. James wrote his first piece, Canon Alberich's Scrapbook. He presented this to Cambridge University's Chit Chat Society in October 1893, thus ushering in a new era of macabre storytelling defined by subtle psychological suggestion, anguish, and torment. It also marked the beginning of the end of the Victorian Gothic ghost story. As mentioned earlier, Letty produced 7 ghostly tales, and I intend to present all of them here on this channel. So we still have The Case of Lady Lukestan, The Trainer's Ghost, The Ghost in the Chair, and the Blue Room to come. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and thank you as always for watching / listening. We'll catch up soon on the next one. Until then, good night or good day.